In the depths of Yellowstone National Park, a heart-wrenching cry pierces the dawn silence. A sound that will forever change one man's understanding of the bond between humans and wild beasts. Subscribe to witness an extraordinary tale of courage, compassion, and a connection that defies the laws of nature as we uncover what happens when kindness meets the untamed heart of the wild. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines as Mike Anderson shouldered his worn leather pack. The familiar weight of 2 decades' worth of wildlife conservation work settled onto his broad shoulders. The crisp autumn air carried the promise of winter, a reminder that nature's clock was ticking relentlessly forward. At 52, Mike had spent more than half his life in these woods, learning their secrets, protecting their inhabitants, and sometimes, just sometimes, witnessing moments that defied explanation. His boots crunched softly against the frost-covered ground as he began his daily patrol. The rising sun painted the forest in hues of amber and gold, filtering through the canopy like nature's own stained glass. Mike paused, his trained ears catching the symphony of the awakening forest, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of an eagle, and the soft padding of deer hooves against fallen pine needles. But then, something else cut through the morning chorus, a sound that made Mike's blood run cold. A deep, guttural sob echoed through the trees, carrying with it a pain so raw it seemed to pierce the very soul of the forest. Mike had heard many sounds in his years as a conservationist, the triumphant roar of a mountain lion, the mournful howl of wolves, even the desperate bleating of injured elk, but this was different. This sound carried something almost human in its agony. Mike's heart hammered against his ribs as he moved toward the source, each step measured and deliberate. 20 years of experience screamed at him to call for backup, to wait for support, to follow protocol. But something deeper, something primal, pulled him forward. The sobs grew louder, punctuated by heavy, labored breathing and the occasional metallic clank that made Mike's stomach turn. He knew that sound all too well. As he rounded a massive Douglas fir, the scene before him stopped him dead in his tracks. In a small clearing, partially hidden by low-hanging branches, lay one of the largest black bears he'd ever encountered. Its massive frame was twisted awkwardly, one front paw caught in the merciless jaws of an illegal steel trap. The ground around the bear was torn up, evidence of its desperate struggle for freedom, and dark blood stained the morning frost. But it was the bear's eyes that captured Mike's attention and held it. They weren't the wild, frightened eyes he expected to see. Instead, they met his gaze with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. Tears, actual tears, rolled down the bear's face, matting its dark fur. In that moment, Mike saw something he'd never seen before in any wild animal, a plea for help. His hand instinctively moved to the tranquilizer gun at his hip, but he hesitated. The bear wasn't thrashing or showing signs of aggression. Instead, it watched him with an almost eerie calm, its chest heaving with each labored breath. Mike's mind raced through his training, through every protocol and safety measure drilled into him over the years. Everything told him to step back, call for support, wait for a team. But the bear let out another sob, and in that sound, Mike heard something that transcended species, pure suffering. He'd spent his entire career trying to protect these creatures, trying to maintain the delicate balance between human development and wildlife preservation. Now, faced with this moment, protocol seemed hollow. Mike slowly lowered himself to a crouch, keeping his movements deliberate and smooth. The bear's eyes followed him, but its body remained still, save for the trembling of pain. "Hey there, big guy," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "I'm going to help you, okay? Just stay with me." He knew the risks. A wounded bear was unpredictable at best, lethal at worst. One swipe of those powerful claws could end his life in an instant. But as he looked into those eyes brimming with pain and something else, something that looked remarkably like hope, Mike made his decision. Reaching slowly into his pack, he pulled out his tools, never breaking eye contact with the bear. The animal's breathing seemed to steady slightly, as if it understood that help had arrived. Mike's own heart thundered in his ears as he edged closer, close enough now to smell the bear's musky scent mixed with the metallic tang of blood. "Easy now," he murmured, more to steady himself than to calm the bear. The trap was an old model, cruel and efficient. Its teeth were buried deep in the bear's flesh. Mike had removed dozens of these over the years, but never with their victim still conscious. Never would his life balance so precariously on the edge of disaster. As he positioned his tools, the bear let out another sob, softer this time, almost like a whimper. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he prepared to attempt something that could either be the most meaningful act of his career, or his last mistake on Earth. The morning sun continued its climb into the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as man and beast faced each other in a moment that would alter both their lives forever. The steel trap's teeth gleamed mockingly in the morning light as Mike positioned his hands on the release mechanism. His palms were slick with sweat despite the autumn chill, and each breath felt like it might be his last. The bear remained unnaturally still, its dark eyes fixed on Mike's every movement with an intensity that seemed to transcend mere animal instinct. "Just hold on," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. "This is going to hurt, but it'll be over soon." He wasn't sure why he was talking. The bear couldn't understand him, but something about those intelligent eyes made silence feel impossible. The mechanism was rusted, probably from months of exposure to the elements. Mike's muscles strained as he applied pressure, trying to find the sweet spot that would release the cruel metal jaws. The bear let out another sigh, this one softer, almost resigned. Mike's heart clenched in his chest. Suddenly, the trap gave way with a harsh metallic screech. The bear's reaction was immediate, a roar of pain that shook the very ground beneath them. Mike stumbled backward, his survival instincts finally kicking in. But he couldn't move fast enough. The bear's massive frame lurched forward, and Mike felt the rush of air as its uninjured paw swept past his face. But the strike never connected. The bear pulled back at the last moment, its claws grazing the air, mere inches from Mike's cheek. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, Mike saw something that defied explanation, recognition, perhaps even gratitude, flickering in those wild depths. Blood flowed freely from the bear's wound now that the trap's pressure was released. The animal's fur was matted and dark, and its massive frame trembled with pain and exhaustion. Mike knew he should leave, should give the creature space to recover or retreat. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, Mike reached into his pack and pulled out his first aid kit. It was meant for humans, but the basic principles would be the same. The bear watched him, its breathing labored but steady, as he laid out gauze and antiseptic. "This is going to sting," Mike warned, his voice growing steadier as the initial shock of survival wore off. But infection would be worse. He kept talking, letting his voice become a constant, soothing presence as he worked. The bear flinched when the antiseptic touched its wound but didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to lean slightly toward Mike, as if accepting his help. The morning light strengthened as Mike cleaned and wrapped the injury as best he could. He knew it wasn't perfect. The bear would need time and its own remarkable healing abilities to fully recover. But it was better than nothing. Throughout the process, the bear remained still, only occasionally letting out soft whimpers of pain. When Mike finally sat back on his heels, his work complete, he found himself reluctant to leave. The bear's eyes hadn't left him, and there was something in that gaze that stirred deep emotions in his chest. In 20 years of wildlife conservation, he'd never experienced anything like this. "You're going to be okay," he said softly, beginning to pack away his supplies. "But you need to rest. Let that heal properly." He knew he was being ridiculous, talking to a wild animal as if it could understand, but the bear's attentive gaze made it impossible not to. As Mike stood, his legs slightly shaky from being crouched for so long, the bear attempted to rise as well. It managed to get to its feet but swayed dangerously, clearly weakened from blood loss and trauma. Without thinking, Mike stepped forward to steady it, his hand touching the bear's thick fur. Time seemed to freeze. Mike's heart stopped as he realized what he'd done, touched a wounded wild bear, breaking every rule of wildlife interaction he'd ever learned. But the bear didn't react with violence. Instead, it leaned slightly into his touch, its massive head lowering until Mike could feel its warm breath on his arm. The moment lasted only seconds before the bear pulled away, but it felt like an eternity. With deliberate movements, the animal turned and began to limp toward the deeper forest. It paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back at Mike one last time. In that final glance, Mike saw something that would haunt him for days to come, a depth of understanding that shouldn't exist in a wild creature's eyes. Then the bear was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the ancient forest, leaving Mike alone with the blood-stained trap and an overwhelming sense that something extraordinary had just occurred. As Mike collected the trap as evidence, his hands still trembling slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a successful rescue. Something had passed between him and that bear, something that defied explanation or rational thought. He looked down at the cruel metal device in his hands, its teeth still stained with blood, and felt a surge of determination. These traps were illegal for a reason, and somewhere out there, someone was setting them without regard for the suffering they caused. Mike would find them, but first, he needed to make sure the bear survived. As he headed back to his station to report the incident, Mike found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see those intelligent eyes watching him from the shadows. The forest seemed different now, charged with possibility and mystery. He didn't know if he'd ever see the bear again, but he knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed in some fundamental way. The morning sun had risen fully now, turning the forest into a cathedral of light and shadow. Mike's footsteps seemed lighter somehow, despite the weight of the experience he'd just been through. He'd acted against all his training, risked his life on instinct alone, and somehow emerged not just alive but transformed. As he reached the edge of his patrol zone, a distant sound caught his attention, not a sob this time, but a low rumbling call that seemed to echo through the trees. Mike smiled, recognizing it as a bear's way of communicating. Whether it was his bear or another, he couldn't be sure, but he chose to take it as a sign that this was only the beginning. The days following the rescue took on a dreamlike quality as Mike resumed his normal patrols. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow among the trees made him search for a glimpse of his unlikely patient. The wound had been severe, and despite his first aid efforts, infection remained a serious concern. Each morning, he found himself scanning the forest floor for signs, tracks, blood trails, anything that might tell him the bear had survived. It was on the 5th day that Mike first noticed something odd. He was checking one of the wildlife cameras when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. That peculiar sensation of being watched, a feeling he'd learned never to ignore in the wilderness, crept over him slowly. He turned his head instinctively, moving to the bear spray at his hip. Nothing, just the endless rows of pine stretching into shadow. But as he resumed his work, a twig snapped in the distance, too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate to be random. Mike froze, listening intently. Another crack, closer this time, followed by the soft sound of padded feet on fallen leaves. His heart quickened as a massive shape emerged from the shadows. It was a bear, moving with a slight limp but otherwise looking stronger than he'd dared hope. The bandages were gone, probably torn off or worn away, but the wound appeared to be healing cleanly. The bear paused about 30 yards away, those same intelligent eyes fixed on Mike with unmistakable recognition. "Well, look who's up and about," Mike said softly, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but it made no aggressive moves. Instead, it settled onto its haunches, watching him with what Mike could have sworn was curiosity. That evening became the first of many similar encounters. Every few days, Mike would sense a presence during his rounds, only to turn and find the bear observing him from a respectful distance. It never approached too closely, never threatened or displayed aggression, it simply watched, following him on his patrols like a silent guardian. The other rangers thought he was losing his mind when he reported these incidents. "Bears don't behave that way," they told him. "It's probably different bears you're seeing." But Mike knew better. He recognized those eyes, that distinctive scar on its right shoulder that he hadn't noticed during the rescue. This was his bear, and it was deliberately keeping tabs on him. One rainy morning, about 3 weeks after the rescue, the true nature of their unusual bond became clear. Mike was marking trees for a future conservation study when he heard it, the low growl of a mountain lion, close enough to make his blood run cold. Before he could react, a massive, dark shape burst from the undergrowth, placing itself between Mike and the unseen threat, the bear. His bear stood on its hind legs, reaching its full impressive height, and let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The mountain lion's answering scream cut off abruptly, followed by the sound of retreating paws. The bear dropped back to all fours, turned to look at Mike with those eerie, knowing eyes, then melted back into the forest as if nothing had happened. Mike stood there, rain soaking through his jacket, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The bear hadn't just happened to be nearby, it had been watching, waiting. And when danger threatened, it had chosen to protect him. The implications were staggering. As weeks turned into months, the bear's presence became a constant in Mike's life. He began to notice patterns in its behavior. It would appear more frequently when he worked in areas known for dangerous wildlife activity. It would make itself visible when he ventured into unfamiliar territory, as if ensuring he didn't stray into danger. Sometimes it would lead him to injured animals or areas where poachers had left new traps. The other rangers started calling it Mike's shadow, half joking, but with an undercurrent of unease. Mike didn't care. He'd long since stopped trying to explain the relationship to others. How could he describe the way the bear would sit and listen when he talked through difficult decisions out loud, or how it seemed to understand his moods, staying closer on days when the weight of his job felt particularly heavy? One crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after their first encounter, Mike arrived at his favorite lookout point to find the bear already there, waiting. But this time, it wasn't alone. Two cubs played in the fallen leaves nearby, their dark fur gleaming in the early light. The bear, which Mike now realized was female, watched calmly as her cubs tumbled and wrestled, occasionally glancing at him as if to share her pride. Mike sank to the ground, keeping his movements slow and deliberate out of habit, though he knew she wouldn't harm him. The cubs, noticing him for the first time, stopped their play to stare curiously. Their mother made a soft chuffing sound, and to Mike's amazement, the cubs bounded closer, their natural fear of humans apparently overridden by their mother's trust in him. As he watched the family, Mike felt tears prick at his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The bear hadn't just remembered him as the man who freed her from the trap. She had chosen to make him part of her world, to share with him one of the most vulnerable and precious aspects of her life, her cubs. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the trees. As Mike sat in peaceful companionship with this extraordinary family, he thought about all the reports he'd have to write, all the regulations he'd have to navigate to protect this area, these bears. None of it mattered in this moment. He wasn't a ranger or a conservationist, he was simply part of something larger than himself, something ancient and profound, the unspoken bond between man and nature. The cubs eventually tired of their exploration and returned to their mother's side. She rose, gathering them with gentle nudges, and led them back into the forest depths. But before she disappeared, she turned to look at Mike one last time, and in her eyes, he saw not just intelligence but wisdom. This was more than a story of rescue and gratitude, it was a reminder that in the wild, extraordinary things were possible if you only opened your heart to believe in them. The first warning signs were subtle, broken branches that didn't match animal patterns, strange scents that didn't belong in the forest, and unusual gaps in the normal wildlife activity. Mike had spent enough years in these woods to recognize the telltale signs of human intrusion. His bear seemed to sense it too, her appearances becoming more frequent, her behavior more alert. One misty morning, Mike found fresh boot prints near a stream where he had previously removed traps. They were still sharp in the mud, no more than a few hours old. His radio crackled with a report of suspicious vehicles spotted at the north entrance. Something was brewing, and Mike's instincts told him it wasn't good. His bear materialized from the fog like a ghost, her massive form barely visible in the gray light. She moved with purpose, her head low, tracking something. Mike followed, trusting her instincts more than his own. The cubs were nowhere in sight, she must have hidden them somewhere safe. They moved deeper into the forest, away from the marked trails. The bear paused, occasionally testing the air, her muscles tense beneath her thick fur. Mike's hand rested on his radio, ready to call for backup, but something held him back. The fog muffled their movements, creating an eerie silence broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from the trees. Then they heard it, voices, low and urgent, coming from a clearing ahead. The bear froze, her ears swiveling toward the sound. Mike crouched behind a fallen log, peering through the mist. Three men moved through the clearing, their movements practiced and efficient. They carried rifles and heavy packs, and Mike's heart sank as he watched them setting up sophisticated traps, not the crude steel ones he usually found, but high-tech devices designed for large game. These weren't opportunistic locals looking for an easy kill. These were professional poachers, well-equipped and organized. Mike had heard rumors of such groups moving into the area, targeting bears specifically for the black market. His hand moved to his radio, but before he could call it in, one of the men turned, scanning the tree line. The bear tensed beside him, a low growl building in her throat. Mike placed a gentle hand on her fur, silently willing her to stay still. They were outnumbered, and those rifles weren't for show. The poachers continued their work, unaware of their audience, setting up a perimeter of traps that would funnel any large animal into their killing zone. Mike's mind raced. He needed to document this, needed proof to bring these men to justice. Slowly, he reached for his camera, but his movement caused a branch to snap beneath his foot. The sound, amplified by the fog, cut through the silence like a gunshot. The poachers spun toward the noise, rifles raised. The bear beside Mike rose to her full height. Her protective instincts took over before Mike could stop her. She burst from cover with a roar that seemed to shake the very air. The poachers' shouts of surprise turned to fear as the massive bear charged through their camp, scattering their equipment. Mike used the chaos to his advantage, quickly snapping photos while keeping low. The bear wasn't actually attacking, she was creating a diversion, knocking over their supplies and destroying their traps. Her intelligence continued to amaze him, even in this moment of crisis. One of the poachers raised his rifle, taking aim at the bear. Without thinking, Mike burst from his hiding place, tackling the man. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as they crashed to the ground. The other poachers turned toward the commotion, but the bear was already there, placing herself between Mike and the threat. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. The poachers faced the terrifying sight of an enraged mother bear standing protectively over a park ranger, their carefully laid plans literally in pieces around them. When the bear took one step forward, they broke, turning and fleeing into the fog. Mike scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. The bear watched the poachers retreat, her sides heaving with exertion. When she turned to check on him, her eyes held that same incredible intelligence he'd grown to know so well. They'd worked together, human and bear, to protect their shared home. Backup arrived within minutes of Mike's radio call, but the poachers were long gone. They'd left behind enough evidence to build a solid case, including Mike's photos and the sophisticated traps that could be traced back to known trafficking networks. As the other rangers processed the scene, Mike stood with his bear at the edge of the clearing, both of them watching the activity with satisfied exhaustion. "You know," he said quietly to her, "we make a pretty good team." The bear huffed softly, as if in agreement, before melting back into the forest to check on her cubs. Mike watched her go, still amazed by her actions. She hadn't just protected herself or her cubs, she'd chosen to help him stop a threat to all the bears in the forest. That evening, as Mike filed his report, he chose his words carefully. How could he explain what had happened without sounding crazy? How could he describe the level of cooperation, of understanding, that had existed between him and a wild bear? In the end, he stuck to the facts, the poachers, the evidence, the intervention that had stopped them. The rest would remain between him and his extraordinary friend. The forest felt different after that day. The bond between Mike and the bear had evolved into something deeper, a partnership forged in the defense of their shared territory. She continued to patrol with him more openly now, and other rangers began to accept her presence as something unique but real. As Mike walked the familiar trails in the dying light, he reflected on how far they'd come from that first desperate encounter with the trap. The bear had transformed from a creature needing rescue to a protector in her own right, and their unlikely alliance had become something that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild. The mist had lifted, revealing a sky painted in twilight colors. Somewhere in the growing darkness, a mother bear watched over her cubs, ready to defend not just them but the entire forest she called home. And she had chosen a human, chosen him, to help her in that mission. Mike smiled, knowing that their story was far from over. Lightning split the summer sky as Mike jolted awake in his cabin, the air thick with an acrid smell that made his heart race. Smoke poured through his window. An orange glow painted the night clouds. Fire in the northwest section of the forest, and it was spreading fast. His radio crackled to life with urgent evacuation orders. As he rushed to dress, the drought had left the forest dangerously dry, and the lightning storm had provided the spark. By the time Mike reached his vehicle, the wind was driving the flames forward at an alarming rate. He could hear the fires roar even from this distance, a sound like a freight train bearing down on everything in its path. His first thought was of the bear and her cubs. Their usual territory lay directly in the fire's path. The radio squawked with coordinates and instructions, but Mike was already turning his truck toward the old-growth forest where he'd last seen them. The smoke grew thicker as he drove, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. When the road became impassable, Mike continued on foot, his years of experience guiding him through the familiar terrain. The heat was intense now, and burning embers rained down around him. He could hear the panic of fleeing wildlife, the thunder of elk herds, the screeching of birds, all racing to escape the inferno. A familiar roar cut through the chaos, not of fire, but of his bear. She burst through the smoke, cubs nowhere in sight. Her fur was singed, her eyes wild with fear, but when she saw Mike, she didn't run. Instead, she turned and looked back the way she'd come, then at him. Her behavior was urgent and purposeful. "Lead the way," Mike shouted over the roar of the flames. Without hesitation, the bear turned and plunged back into the smoke. Mike followed, pulling his emergency respirator over his face. They moved through the burning forest together, the bear choosing paths that avoided the worst of the flames. They found the cubs trapped on a rocky outcrop, cut off by a wall of fire. The smaller of the two was injured, limping badly, explaining why they hadn't been able to keep up with their mother. The bear looked at Mike, and in her eyes, he saw desperation. She couldn't carry both cubs to safety. Mike didn't hesitate. He stripped off his jacket, wrapping it around the injured cub. Despite the risk of being clawed or bitten, through his amazement, the cub remained calm, as if sensing his intent to help. The mother bear gathered her stronger cub, and together they began their retreat. The journey back was a nightmare of heat and smoke. The fire had encircled them, leaving only a narrow corridor of escape. Mike's lungs burned despite his respirator, and his arms ached from carrying the cub. The bear led them through the inferno with uncanny precision, choosing paths that seemed to anticipate the fire's movement. They were nearly clear when a burning tree crashed down before them, sending up a shower of sparks. The bear roared in frustration, searching for another route. Mike's heart sank as he realized they were running out of options. The fire was closing in on all sides, and the smoke was becoming unbearable. Then the bear did something extraordinary. She sat down her uninjured cub and began clearing debris from a hollow beneath a large boulder, a space just big enough for Mike and the cubs to shelter. Mike understood immediately. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it might protect them long enough for the fire's main front to pass. He crawled in with both cubs, pressing as far back as possible. The bear remained outside, using her massive body to shield the entrance from falling embers. The heat was intense, and Mike could hear the roar of the fire growing closer. He cradled the cubs, who pressed against him in terror, their wild nature forgotten in the face of this greater threat. Minutes stretched like hours as the firestorm raged around them. Mike could feel the bear's body tensing against the heat, but she didn't move from her protective position. Through gaps in the smoke, he caught glimpses of the inferno, trees exploding into flame, the very air seeming to burn. Finally, the roar began to diminish. The bear moved away from the entrance, checking if it was safe to emerge. When she returned, her fur was badly singed, but her eyes were clear and determined. They climbed out to find a transformed landscape. The forest was still burning, but the main front had passed. Mike's radio crackled to life. Rescue teams were searching for him, but before he could respond, the bear gently took her injured cub from his arms. She looked at him one last time, and in that moment, Mike saw something profound, not just gratitude, but a deep understanding. They had faced death together and emerged not just as survivors, but as something more. As Mike watched the bear lead her cubs away through the smoldering forest, he felt a sense of awe. Nature's most fundamental law was survival, yet this wild creature had risked everything to protect him, just as he had done for her. Their bond had transcended the natural order, becoming something that defied explanation. Later, after the fire was contained and Mike had been treated for smoke inhalation, he stood at the edge of the burn zone. The forest would recover. It always did, but it would take time. Already, he could see signs of hope, small green shoots pushing through the ash, birds returning to survey their former territories. His radio buzzed with reports of wildlife returning to the area. Among them were sightings of a mother bear and two cubs, moving through the charred landscape with purpose. Mike smiled, knowing they had all been changed by the fire. The forest would regrow, and with it, the bond between a man and a bear would continue to flourish. Proof that even in nature's darkest moments, extraordinary connections could survive and thrive. As the sun set over the blackened trees, Mike heard a distant roar, not of fire this time, but of life, of resilience, of a friendship that had been tested by flame and emerged stronger. He turned toward home, knowing that somewhere in the recovering forest, his unlikely family was doing the same. Years passed, and the burned forest slowly healed. New growth pushed through the ashes, and wildlife returned to reclaim their territories. Mike's hair had turned gray at the temples, but his dedication to the forest remained unchanged. The story of his bond with the bear had become something of a legend among the younger rangers, though few believed it in its entirety. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day he'd first found her in the trap, Mike stood at his favorite overlook. 20 years of protecting these woods had taught him patience and had shown him that nature worked in cycles that couldn't be rushed. The scars of the Great Fire were still visible, but they had softened, becoming part of the forest's story rather than its tragedy. He didn't see the bear as often now. She was older, like him, and had raised several sets of cubs. Sometimes months would pass between their encounters, but she always returned, as if checking on an old friend. Her cubs from the fire had grown and established their own territories, but occasionally Mike would spot one of them, recognizing their mother's intelligent eyes and distinctive markings. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Mike from his reverie. Sarah Chun, one of the newest rangers, joined him at the overlook. At 26, she reminded him of himself when he'd first started, eager, idealistic, and deeply committed to wildlife conservation. "I hoped I'd find you here," she said, catching her breath. "We're picking up some strange readings from the motion sensors in Sector 7, and there's something else you should see." Mike followed her down the trail, his joints protesting slightly at the pace. The morning dew had barely dried when they reached the location. Sarah pointed to a cluster of broken branches and disturbed earth. At first, I thought it was just normal bear activity, but look at this pattern. It's deliberate, like they're trying to tell us something." Mike knelt to examine the signs, a smile tugging at his lips. He recognized his handiwork. The markings weren't random, they were signals. He and his bear had developed them over years of cooperation. She was warning them about something. Following the trail, they discovered an illegal hunting blind, recently constructed and well hidden. But instead of finding poachers, they found evidence that bears had systematically dismantled parts of it, not through random destruction, but with precise targeting of its weak points. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah whispered. "It's almost like they're protecting the forest themselves." Mike's heart swelled with pride. "They are. They've learned that not all humans are enemies, that some of us are allies in preserving their home. And they're passing that knowledge down through generations." As if in response to his words, a familiar form emerged from the trees. The bear, his bear, moved with the deliberate grace of age. Her muzzle was now grayed, but her eyes were as bright and intelligent as ever. Sarah gasped, instinctively stepping back, but Mike remained still. "It's okay," he said softly. "She's an old friend." The bear approached, stopping a respectful distance away. Behind her, to Mike's amazement, came two younger bears, not cubs, but not fully grown either. One of them carried the distinctive scar pattern of his grandmother, and both moved with the same purposeful awareness that had always characterized the bear's behavior. "She's teaching them," Sarah breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The stories about you and her, they're all true, aren't they?" Mike nodded, watching as the bear guided her grandcubs in examining the hunting blind. What had started as a single act of compassion had grown into something larger. She had learned to trust, and then she had taught others to trust, not blindly, but wisely, discriminating between those who would harm and those who would protect. The younger bears worked with surprising coordination, dismantling the blind while their grandmother watched. Mike could see his bears' influence in their movements, in the way they problem-solved and worked together. She had created a legacy that went beyond mere survival. "This changes everything we thought we knew about bear behavior," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "The implications for conservation, for human-wildlife cooperation, it changes everything." Mike agreed. The capacity for understanding was always there. We just needed to open our hearts to see it. As the young bears finished their work, the old bear turned to Mike. Their eyes met, and 2 decades of shared experiences passed between them. She was showing him that her work would continue through her descendants, just as it would continue through rangers like Sarah. The moment was interrupted by a call on Sarah's radio. Another sector needed attention. As she turned to leave, Mike remained behind, watching the 3 bears disappear into their forest. His bear paused at the tree line, looking back one final time. In her eyes, Mike saw not just the intelligence that had first struck him 20 years ago, but wisdom, understanding, and something that could only be described as love. That evening, as Mike sat on his cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What had started with a cry of pain in the forest had grown into something that would outlive both him and the bear. A bridge between 2 worlds, a testament to the power of compassion and trust. The forest was changing, and so was he. But in the quiet moments of twilight, Mike knew one thing for certain. The legacy of his bond with the bear was not just one of survival, it was one of hope, of learning, and of a deeper connection between all living things. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.